No problem. So we created this space inside of IARPC Collaborations to advance sort of the kind of community collective level work that's seeking to advance Arctic observing and data systems through different kinds of tools, approaches, community of practice things, including the Arctic Observing Summit as such an important focus. And so I'm going to just share some slides for people who are maybe new to some of these acronyms and some of this context, just so that we can all, at least to one degree or another, start on the same page. So let's see, get my slides going. So first, we're going to do our welcome, where we're kind of sitting right now, do a little bit of this orientation, who we are in terms of the conveners of the meeting, who else is in the room, and then kind of situate this discussion in the broader context of the Interagency Arctic Research Policy Committee, and just with the assistance of one of our US AON board co-chairs, talk a little bit more specifically about the role of the board and why it's so important that our board is here with us today. So some of you have maybe seen this infographic that we use to kind of as a bit of an explainer about what the U.S. Arctic Observing Network is and what it works on. And so this beautiful picture of fog bows over Summit Station in Greenland. The horizon line kind of depicts the science policy interface, science or technology policy interface in some cases, which those of us who work in these spaces realize it's not even close to a straight line. There's a lot of entanglement between science and technology issues from the grassroots side and policy issues from the grassroots side, and those same issues within our federal agencies. But in principle, what we're really trying to do is to create an interface where we can dialogue effectively about the enablers, the constraints, and other topics like we're going to talk about today that help us work towards our goal of advancing um, our capabilities, especially in support of broadly recognized societal benefits. So the USA on board, and I'll show you who's on the board in a moment, kind of sits in the center of this. One of the nice capacities that the board has as a subcommittee, so our USA on board is a subcommittee of the Interagency Arctic Research Policy Committee. It has direct contact with the heads of our federal agencies through the IARPC principles. And so there's some conversation that can rise to the highest levels of leadership, including the conversations that we're having today. And then on the other side of the infographic are these paler facets of USAON, and this represents a lot of the work that Hazel and I do outside the context or kind of adjacent to the context of the federal board, where we work with different kinds of funded projects, national and international, and then also through this community of practice model. And so that center blue infographic, the USA on board, hopefully you recognize some familiar faces here, some of whom are also on our call joining us today. And these are really the folks who manage our federal programs that are so critical to our success and everything we do. We have a lot of great opportunities to talk to them about what we think is important and needs to move forward, and this is one of them. So we're really happy to have everybody here today. We are currently chaired by NASA. Alexandra Giese is our current chair, and NOAA and NSF are vice chairs. And just due to a lot of the transitions and reorganizations in the federal government, we currently have a lot of vacancies in our federal board, but we are continuing on in our mission as has been laid forth by our terms of reference, and which is consistent with our gathering here today. So just to kind of work through some of the acronyms that can kind of get us tangled up. So on the left, we have this adapted image from Roberts and al. The image itself was created to depict the Arctic system of systems and the integrated kind of picture and complexity that's represented by these systems. And we put this diagram here because the Arctic Observing Network concept really relates. It's not for any one topic, one sphere of activity. It cuts across what we think of as the spheres, the biosphere, the cryosphere, et cetera, but also human dimensions and the lived realities of the Arctic environment. And so the AON concept itself came from a National Academies study in 2006. And this is what we think of as the Pan-Arctic network of networks and the data sharing and collection that goes along with it. We might be conducting this data collection from community observations, moorings and buoys, gauge networks, satellites, et cetera. So it's a really complex space, and part of why it really calls for so much coordination. Next on the acronym list is USAON, and so this is what we are doing nationally to facilitate the coordination and planning to support effective efforts. We also are recognized as USAN is recognized as our national committee to sustaining Arctic observing networks, which is the next acronym on the list. And SAON is the international facilitator concerned with these same issues. Uh, Oops, sorry, I went ahead. So SAON is the international body, US AON is our national body. As I think was clear on the infographic that we started with, US AON includes our federal board, but also direct NOAA funding and support for my role, and direct NSF funding and support for Hazel's role, and then also some grassroots projects that people like yourselves pull together from the community in partnership with USAON through other funding mechanisms. Okay, so I think this is where I hand it over to David Allen, if you're ready to speak to these slides, and I can advance the slides for you.
Awesome. Thank you. Hi, everyone, and thank you, Sandy. And before I go on too much further, I guess I would argue that yes, the board is really important, but I think we would be absolutely nowhere without you and Hazel and the work that you do to actually make everything possible. And this has been I'll personally thank you for all the progress that we have made in the past year and a half. I think it's been an extraordinarily productive period, and just really exciting. So this is an important note. IARPC is sort of the basis for a lot of our work. Luckily, we have this Arctic research plan that spans this period, 2022 to 2026. But as you'll see on the left-hand side of the screen, the last annual principals meeting was September of 2024. And we currently lack an executive director who also is dual-hatted as the assistant director for the polar sciences at OSTP. And there is also we're also lacking a chair for our IARPC at this point. There is a nominee for NSF director, but I don't know that there are any scheduled hearings or plans to actually put that person in place anytime soon. And can we turn to the next slide, please? So in addition to the IARPC strategy that we have in place, we also have this really convenient report that we developed in 2022, right at the beginning of the IARPC strategy, on the need to establish and maintain sustained Arctic Observing Network. In the center is a QR code to the USAON resources page, where you can find all of these reports. But this report actually has turned out to be really support a lot of the work that a lot of the ongoing work that USAON still still does and is still pursuing. So there was a lot there, and luckily we have that to lean on to really to propel us forward. Um, and uh, and I would encourage you also to really look at this on the right-hand side, this biennial accomplishments report. It's a really great encapsulation of much of the work that we've done over the last couple of years. And as I've noted already, it's been really quite productive. And if we go on to the next slide. So we have this great sort of configuration of US AON in the United States that connects to all of the interagency as well as international nodes that Sandy mentioned in those earlier slides. It's really unique in terms of its access to the federal space. And amazingly, this high impact activity is actually driven by two full-time staff. And I would actually say um, more like 1 3/4, 1 1/2, depending on how busy Hazel is with other IARPC things, because she's actually a driving force behind a lot of different IARPC activities too in her free time. Uh, and we also have this board of volunteers that actually have many competing priorities. So it's actually a really it's amazing how much we actually get done with all the volunteer activity and the relatively limited staff that we have actually working on a day-to-day basis on these activities. Where we've had real traction recently is both on planning and assessments, and I'll be turning to that shortly. Um, uh, for those who haven't been paying attention or haven't been up to speed, a really nice tool called that allows us to do assessments of observing systems has been developed, and here we are. It looks like can you maybe space bar to go ahead and get the graphic up? Okay, thank you. So it is called the benefit tool. The acronym is actually explained down here on the bottom of the slide. And I guess the important notes for this is that it is a participatory method that's co-designed with federal agencies, researchers, indigenous scholars, and community partners. There is actually a methods development committee that is behind a lot of this work. That is a group configured with all of those different parties and partners in it. And what it does is actually map the full pathway or value chain from observing system inputs all the way to societal benefits. And that's a relatively rare capability in the federal space. Everyone, it's one of those things that everybody wants to understand, but is very difficult to do in a rigorous, repeatable way. And what it does is identify performance gaps and criticality across that value chain. And if we move to the next slide, please. So this is really exciting. We are at a point now where Hazel and Sandy have actually moved into this risks and hazard space supported by the 60 seconds. Okay. Supported by the board and guided by the board, have actually created all of these great technical briefs that are based on benefit assessments. I urge you to go to the resources page that's noted on the bottom right. There's a lot of good material there. So far published, the coastal flooding and aviation weather, wildfires is coming up shortly, and landslides as well. Those are all really high impact and high relevance stories that are important for Alaska. And if we go to the next slide, let's see whether I can blaze through this. So here are some more QR codes, as well as another reference to the US AON resources page. Encourage you to really engage with this material. Excitingly, there is also an AGU book chapter that actually really codifies and describes the risks and hazard work in detail, and explains the methodology that was utilized to use the benefit assessment tool. And if we go to the next slide, this is probably the most relevant slide to segue into this discussion. All of these are a variety of different future directions that are informed by work at ASSW and AOS. And up on top is a variety of different capacities and synergies that we have, connections to roads, the benefit tool, convening, the risks and hazards, working as very high relevance activities, and then this, as Sandy's comments and I believe Hazel's opening comments also alluded to, IPY5 is still considered a major opportunity, but U.S. involvement remains undefined at this point. So there's lots of questions about level of effort and level of funding, et cetera, that how we can be involved in and engaged. So rather than I'm sure I've gone beyond my last 60 seconds, so guess I should stop and thank everyone for their attention and look forward to the further discussions and presentations. Thanks.
Thank you, David. Yeah, appreciate it. And I apologize for the timekeeping. That's going to be part of my job during this meeting, is just sort of trying to keep us rolling forward, because we did set ourselves up with a lot of content to cover. And so, yeah, I just want to make that note. And for the folks that are presenting in the next section, we're aiming for about 5 minutes per person. And so if you're starting to run over, I will put a note in the chat. If you don't see the chat, I'll give you like I'm just going to come off of mute and say, hey, can you wrap up soon? And I mean it in the kindest possible way. Everything that everyone is presenting is really important. And my only goal in that is to make sure that the folks at the end have equal opportunity to present and share. So just to say that out loud so everyone knows, we are going to dive in now to our Arctic Observing Summit recap. And to get us started, thank you, Alice, who's was the chair of the meeting this year, for offering to give us a little bit of a description of what the Arctic Observing Summit is for folks who are unfamiliar. And then we will roll forward from there.
Thanks, Hazel. Looking through the participant list, I think most of us have engaged with the Arctic Observing Summit at some point, but not everyone. So I wanted to do the very, very quick primer on the AOS. So the Arctic Observing Summit is a biennial meeting. It's been going since 2013, but every other year since 2014, where the idea is to bring together different parts of the Arctic observing community, whether that is scientists and researchers, indigenous communities, operational agencies, funders, people who are using observations, people who are making observations. And rather than being kind of a standard science meeting format, it's organized into sessions and discussions, but really emphasis on the discussion. There's a very small amount of presentations and a lot of conversation and trying to generate ideas, plans, next steps. So we are working on the report right now. I expect it'll be out in the beginning of June. We'll certainly distribute it through IARPC channels. But today we'll be hearing from a number of the sessions at this last Arctic Observing Summit, with some of the recommendations and action items to come out of it. But I want to make it very clear that these ideas were really the product of a lot of putting a lot of bright people in a room together for a few days, and with the goal of coming up with actionable steps towards a better Arctic observing system.
All right, this is more or less the order we're going to go in, but Chantel, I think I'm going to have you actually go after Alice. So I moved your slide forward, and then we'll just keep rolling.
So I said the AOS is a biennial meeting. That has an asterisk on it, which is to say it has been, but the AOS is at a point where it needs new leadership. We're kind of a transition between, or from some chairs to hopefully next. And so we're using this time to revisit the goals and the structure of the summit. So there is a group that's together thinking about kind of big questions, how the goals, focus of AOS should evolve. where the really unique contribution of the Arctic Observing Summit is in the community, which groups, which kind of perspectives are we missing from AOS conversations, and how do we get them back involved? But at the same time, very practical things, thinking about sustainable models of leadership. Is the venue and format for the AOS still working well for the community? Can we make kind of parts of how it's run more sustainable? And then thinking about the outputs, how can we make recommendations from the summit be most impactful? And how should the Arctic Observing Summit, as both a thing and a venue for conversation, interact with other initiatives? So if you can go to the next slide. The transition planning team is kind of thinking on basically a triage model. So we have a fast turnaround decision about a 2028 Arctic Observing Summit at ASSW, whether that is a venue and a timing that we can do, because we are looking for new chairs. So if you're interested in chairing the Arctic Observing Summit, please let me know. But then also thinking about kind of a short-term review, what does AOS look like in the near term? Again, is ASSW continuing to be the right venue for it? And also, how should AOS be involved in things like planning for the IPY? At the same time, we're thinking about a longer term review, looking for external funding for professional reviewers that can really kind of get into, through interviews, surveys, reading, all of the reports that have come out of the field in the last decade. Where does AOS serve the most value, and how can the summit be adapted to both best kind of do what we're good at and meet the needs that still exist? So again, if you are interested in the future of the Arctic Observing Summit, please let me know, either if you're interested in potentially chairing something in the future, which you'd be my hero, and if you're not interested but you have thoughts, happy to take those too.
Thanks, Alice. Chantel, if you're on.
Hi, sorry, I'm here. Just managed to quadruple book myself as we all do. So thank you so much for letting me sneak in and give a brief overview for the data session from AOS. So we had the two sessions throughout. One was the actionable data towards international employer year, and then we had data as protections. Both were kind of just discussion based. But actual data towards IPY was more focused on international efforts and interoperability, and where, lessons learned from IPY 4, and then where do we want to be for upcoming IPY 5. We haven't quite figured out our exact recommendations yet. We were grateful to Alice to give us a couple more weeks to help get our ducks in a row there. But we had some really good discussions, and it was in parallel actually to the technology session around AI assisted technologies and how that would aid interoperability and data sharing moving forward. So I anticipate some of our recommendations from that session being kind of more oriented towards that, but also, of course, the continued collaboration and discussions around open data frameworks and how we would navigate that in the current geopolitical situation and whatnot. So that primed us really well for our second session, which is data as protection, which really kind of highlighted indigenous data sovereignty practices that are currently in place. We had 5 wonderful presenters highlighting very North American-based experiences, but still obviously quite relevant. Where we had a presenter talk about how to incorporate indigenous knowledge, but also like practices into AI models. We had a workshop highlight from Stephanie Carroll, who is the real mastermind behind the CARE principles. Kana, who is highlighting on how to actually operationalize the CARE principles, but from an indigenous lens, and having indigenous peoples make use of affair and care and things like that moving forward. And then we had a time for a bit of a discussion, which we wish we had more, but obviously these conversations can go on forever and ever, but where we highlighted some of the challenges in actually operationalizing or practicalities around data sovereignty and indigenous data. So we had some just really good conversations around there, of course, about like data infrastructures, equitable access, cultural appropriate stewardship, but from both sides for both Western researchers and also supporting more indigenous-led initiatives for data sharing and whatnot there. So I think that's our major highlights. Just keep an eye out as we put together and, like I said, get our ducks in a row to have our actual recommendations come out of that. But it was really great conversations, and we had some new faces in the room that we don't normally get at AOS. So it was always great, and we're happy to have the space.
Thanks, Chantal. I think we have Margaret up next.
Hi, I'm Margaret Rudolph. My Inupiat name's Anamak, and I'm presenting on the Indigenous-led Observing Working Group recommendations. And so this is really under the leadership of Victoria Bushman, who works for Inuit Circumpolar Council Greenland. And it really was a cross-cutting like topic and session across multiple sessions. It really wasn't like one specific session. There were several under this, as well as a parallel sessions within the Indigenous Pavilion. And I did want to introduce that as a concept. So this year at Arctic Science Summit Week, as well as last year, there was the Indigenous Pavilion. This year, again, it was run by a Greenlandic Inuit, Daniel Lyrath Hopman, and he was able to work with a Sami company to get an alavu, a tent outside, as well as one of the nights. During culture night, they cooked reindeer and shared that. It was a great space to convene both for Indigenous people and talk about culture and share art, dance, stories, as well as a really good place to host some of the sessions that were about working with Indigenous people. How do we work ethically? How do we work more collaboratively? It was really great space because it was large enough that really we could fit probably 80 people in a circle and really kind of share and have that dynamic. And so it was a really great space for that. And so these are the recommendations. They were really edited quite intensely by the group, part of this working group. So I didn't edit them, but I did bold kind of some of the important parts, such as Indigenous observing is essential to Arctic observing systems, and acknowledging that Indigenous people have long observed environmental change and live these realities every day, govern their own lands, waters, and ice, and have led decision-making in the Arctic. And then to ensure Indigenous observations are recognized as essential components of observing systems across marine, terrestrial, freshwater, coastal, ice, and other environments. Next slide. And then this one is really a comment about the identity, terminology, and politics of the concept of Indigenous in Arctic observing. Recognize that there are international contexts and mechanisms for Indigenous people, but it is quite complicated in practice and within region. And really kind of the main point is to shift the expectations to really treat Indigenous peoples as equal partners with self-determination in observing priorities, methods, and governance, and recognize that Indigenous observing supports self-government and self-management is not just research collaboration. Next slide. Funding, the direct funding to Indigenous people-owned organizations is a big call. Looking at all of the past AOS recommendations, there's a lot on funding, sustainable funding, long-term funding, Indigenous-led funding, co-production of knowledge, and really it keeps coming up, and so it is something that we continue to have to work on. So it is institutionalizing mandated, direct, and consistent funding. We call on the Arctic Council and IASC to financially support the research of Indigenous scholars and also to support cross-border collaboration. Next slide. Strengthen Indigenous spaces within the summit. Again, this is a comment to the Indigenous Pavilion to full financial support of the pavilion. There has been some commitment from IAS, but I think a lot of the details are still being worked out. What does this look like? Because a lot of this has been just more of the initiatives of people within the organizing committee rather than it being something institutionalized as part of IASC and ASSW. Next slide. Review progress on previous Arctic observing recommendations, doing an evaluation of AOS and really thinking about Indigenous experts in those recommendations. Do a gaps analysis to assess progress on earlier recommendations as well. Next slide. Encourage respectful participation aligned with the code of conduct. I think this is self-explanatory. So yeah, next slide. Invest in coordination and facilitation roles ahead of the International Polar Year, and specifically having dedicated Indigenous-led coordination roles to advance Indigenous and community-based observing priorities across networks and working groups. And that was my last slide, I believe. So thank you.
Thank you, Margaret. And with that, we will go next to Emily.
Hi, all. Thanks for joining. It's nice to see so many familiar faces here. I'm Emily Lesak. I'm the research coordinator for the International Arctic Research Center at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. And today I'm representing a really large international group that was instrumental in putting together a series of sessions on the first day of the Arctic Observing Summit focused on enhancing research quality and societal relevance through Indigenous knowledge, co-production, and equitable community engagement. You can see some of the main organizers listed on the bottom of the slide. And if you scan the QR code or access the link I just put in the chat, you can take a look at the white paper that we submitted to the Arctic Observing Summit that really kind of framed this session. Hazel, if you want to go to the next slide. Thanks. So some of the recommendations coming out of this series of 3 sessions are similar to what Margaret just described, but I'll give some highlights and they're also underlined in the next couple of slides. So in terms of recommendations geared toward Arctic researchers, we recommend that they take the responsibility to research and engage in self-learning around the principles and methodological approaches that they should be applying when doing research with community. We encourage IASC to support training, IASC and other organizations to support training in Indigenous methodologies, decolonial methodologies, the CARE data governance principles, and free, prior, and informed consent and cultural competency in recognition that co-production of knowledge requires mixed methodologies. With regard to funders, we recommend co-creating funding solicitations with the Indigenous peoples that they are intended to benefit. Next slide. We recognize that we need to rebalance expectations that are placed on communities and research engagement, and therefore encourage researchers to follow an ethical and equitable model for community engagement that's intended to minimize the burden on Indigenous peoples, communities, organizations, and governments. We recommend that IASC and funders set aside a certain percentage of funding for planning and pre-proposal grant programs that allow for relationship building, capacity building, and supporting co-production of knowledge. And lastly, we ask researchers and institutions to make themselves more accessible to and prepare for respectful engagement. Thanks.
Thanks, Emily. And I believe this next one is Sandy.
Hey, thanks. I just put a short explainer slide in here about the roads process because the Arctic, I should have spelled out the acronym here, the Arctic Roadmap for Observing and Data Systems It was a major source of conversation across many sessions, and there were also 3 sessions dedicated specifically to improving the practices, tools, socialization, understandings around the roads process, with a specific focus at this summit on how we support strong implementation strategies. So what is roads? It's a planning process created by SAON that focuses on centering shared benefits. And like many of the previous slides covered, really recognizing Indigenous knowledge as an observing system and understanding how to, as we're developing good implementation strategies to improve our networks, that Indigenous knowledge is seen as an equal valued resource in these plans. Who is engaged in Arctic roads? SAON, who kind of owns the process, appoints an advisory panel. There's about 15 international members on the advisory panel. It's currently co-chaired by myself and Lauren Devine under her Aleut International hat that she wears. But Rhodes is also the grassroots expert panels that have picked up the tools in the planning process and are moving through the process. So there's 5 pilot efforts covering things from sea ice, salmon fisheries, harmful algal blooms, permafrost, wildfires. And we only just want to grow that family of expert panels, and that was a big part of this session, this set of sessions at the summit this year. And so how does Rhodes work? It's really these expert panels act as a community of practice. They use tools, and there's a multi-stage planning process. And why do we do this? It's because of the great complexities that we were talking about earlier when we introduced this session, and that we need strong planning tools to affect the kinds of coordination that are going to bring forward strong implementation plans for the next generation of Arctic observing activities. Oh, next slide, Hazel. Thanks. So the first session we convened was really looking at how this planning process that we now feel has reached a level of maturity could and should be taken up by groups who are planning IPY activities even as we speak. So how can we use a tool like this to enable IPY scale action and advance the results of the ICARP4 process, which was the planning process that IASC led last year. And so we had a panel discussion with a lot of people who themselves were funders and were not that familiar with roads at the onset. So we tried to get sort of an outsider perspective. And the recommendations I'll highlight were to recognize roads within IPY structures and funding programs. So if there are funding program calls coming out, if there's an opportunity to say, hey, this planning process exists and we think it might be useful for people to use, that would be really enabling. We know that for expert panels, getting through the roads process is consistent with needing something like a planning grant to be effective. I think planning grants have come up a few times in this conversation. And so can we get a census of what's out there and start keeping kind of some living documentation around what kinds of vehicles are a good fit for roads? And then also to make the roads process ever more visible and accessible. And so we're all just in a huge process right now to better socialize it, to work with more early career organizations, and that type of thing. Okay, and then my next slide is so for roads to succeed in its goal of recognizing Indigenous knowledge systems and having Indigenous-led efforts and good partnerships with Indigenous people, we need to make sure that the roads process, its tools, the way we document things, what we're asking these expert panels to do, is supported by capacities for Indigenous engagement. And also for skilled people to be able to move through the process in a good way. So again, a really great recommendation about developing some training programs in partnership with Apex, looking at our success metrics for the process as a whole. We have a handbook that we brought into the summit and that we're going to revise over the summer, and think about the different ways that we can recognize and advocate for implementation strategies that are really focused on things like workforce development in the North and other things that Indigenous communities have identified are important to them. And then finally, to center community values and needs through all stages of the roads process. And then Emily's going to present our third session.
Great, thanks, Sandy. So I'll highlight 3 recommendations that came out of session 3, which is focused on the present and future of roads. This is on the morning of the last day of the Arctic Observing Summit. So the first recommendation is intended for the Arctic Data Committee, as well as the Committee of Networks, the Polar Data Forum, the Roads Advisory Panel, and Documentation Task Team that Sandy just mentioned that's been working on the handbook. With a goal of creating more visibility within the roads process for, in particular, the ADC and CON tools and capacities. And I'll give a specific example of how we might do this in the next slide. So this is work that can start this summer in terms of a dialogue between the writing team working on the handbook and these groups that we've identified. And with the purpose of unlocking the data committee's capabilities for use in the roads process and creating more visibility of roads within these activities. Next slide. So as one particular example of how to better engage data throughout the roads process, this is a recommendation geared toward the Polar Data Forum, the Roads Advisory Panel, as well as expert panel leads. An idea that initially came out of some of the leaders of the Sea Ice expert panel. And this is centered around engaging the roads community in the Polar Data Hackathon process and encouraging participation of expert panel members and sharing experiences, engaging in the hackathon process with different expert panel leads. So initially the thought is that the Sea Ice expert panel would pilot this, but then also engage other expert panel leads in their experience and enable them to think about how they might engage hackathons within their own expert panels. So the Sea Ice expert panel, if there's anyone on the call who's affiliated with the Sea Ice expert panel, maybe they could speak to this during the second half. But the thought was that they would already start planning this as they're starting to realize that they need to know a little bit more about what data are available in terms of sea ice. And how that helps their expert panel members make their recommendations. So a way to initiate this is by starting a dialogue and planning process and connecting various EP leads together with a goal of unlocking the data community's capabilities for use throughout the roads process. So a major take home from this discussion is that data needs to be part of the conversation and part of the process throughout roads and not something that's introduced later on in the process. So having a hackathon that starts with data discovery and then is iterated upon throughout the roads process is one way of doing that. Next slide. So Sandy also mentioned that a goal of these road sessions were to spark some inspiration for future expert panels. And so that's where this third recommendation comes in. So this is focused on the roads advisory panels, roads advisory panel, and the Arctic Council working groups, and is centered around supporting a facilitation team to recruit expert panel members to engage in a scoping process for a Pan-Arctic EP on marine debris that would be led by Indigenous youth. So what is potentially exciting about this is that this would be the first expert panel that would have a Pan-Arctic focus, and it would also be youth-led. So to get there, the plan is to prepare an engagement session at the Arctic Youth Conference, which will be held next year. gauge interest in recruiting members led by Indigenous youth as well as early career professionals, start a scoping process, fund a team of facilitators, host some in-person conversations at the Arctic Youth Conference, and with the purpose of being able to eventually coordinate observations on marine debris throughout the Arctic to inform policy development across governance levels. And that's it. Thanks.
Thanks, Emily. Recognizing that this is a 2-hour meeting, we have 2 more presenters left talking about the salmon expert panels and inventories, 2 really important topics. But before we go into that, I want to give everyone just a moment to stretch. If you need to get a glass of water, do that. We will come back at 5 minutes before the top of the hour. So it's just 3 minutes to do what you need to do. We want you all to stick with us and stay informed. All right, we are going to keep rolling forward. So hopefully you can hear my voice and start to come back to your computer. And we'll give folks just a moment to do that as I switch slides and pass the mic over to Jamie O'Connor.
Good morning, everybody. Well, morning Alaska time. I'm Jamie O'Connor. I am the co-facilitator of the Salmon Expert Panel through the International Arctic Research Center and UAF, and also a marine and Arctic policy practitioner and salmon harvester from Bristol Bay. And I'm here to tell you a bit about the update that the Salmon Expert Panel provided at AOS. And for a little context, I'll start with a little bit more about the Salmon Expert Panel. So it was convened through the AON Roads process that all of you are familiar with. And it scoped between 2022 and 2024, and then has been doing its work as a panel from 2024 onward. And we are comprised of about 14 salmon experts, all rooted in some way in Bristol Bay or Western Alaska, and mostly focused on the kind of intersection of science and policy and community members and Indigenous knowledge and tradition, and how that all of that knowledge can work in support of Chinook salmon in particular, and that symbiosis and relationship with the region. We are finalizing our report, which will contain recommendations for researchers, managers, community members, funders, and we'll hopefully have a lot of good stuff in it for everybody. And we've approached it from a well-being and two-eyed seeing framework, and you'll see that oriented throughout the report and the recommendations. If we could get the next slide, please. And it was all focused surrounding the idea of building really durable, community-driven observing recommendations that centered on a shared Arctic variable of food security and kind of trickling down from there to salmon and then further down to Chinook salmon, and looking at that through the service of community and well-being. Can you get the next slide, please? Our session really focused on updating everybody on the work of the panel and giving folks a preliminary look at the recommendations of the panel and focusing in on implementation strategies between now and fall of 2027 that could help to integrate some of the ideas of the panel into funded projects, hopefully as we go along. There were several buckets that things seem to be falling into, workforce development being a really key one, and rooting observing capacity in local community. Bristol Bay often experiences what we call mosquito science, where people kind of come in and get what they need and then leave. It's a pretty remote area with fairly small-sized communities that grow exponentially in the summer, with the fishing community and research communities kind of descending with the salmon to experience them. And it's a really cool energy to be a part of, but it gets a lot quieter in the wintertime. And there's really great opportunities for community members to be more involved. So we took a look at also the opportunities to do additional convening and to really root a structure like a salmon commission or a salmon coalition that would help not only advise on salmon observing, but facilitate some of those community connections within salmon observing. And then also the need for international collaboration, since salmon are an anadromous species, spend a lot of time out in our shared oceans. We need to know more about what they're up to and what they need from us. And AOS was a really wonderful opportunity to have conversations with people about what we could do there to do more projects such as the International Year of the Salmon and others that you might be familiar with. So keep your eyes peeled for the final report. Hopefully by fall 2026, it will be all beautiful and ready for everyone to see it. And we will look forward to opportunities to collaborate between the entities that participated in the panel and other folks who are interested in this work as we move forward into that implementation phase. And I think that is overall what we talked about. We had some really great input from folks in the room on other ideas on how we could get the word out and projects that folks are interested in doing. So we look forward to continuing that. Thank you.
Thanks, Jamie. And Bill, yeah, take it away.
Great. So thank you. Bill Manley, University of Colorado Boulder research scientist, and I also help lead the SAON Polar Observing Assets Working Group. So we had a single session at AOS. This is with Alice, Hazel, Shannon, and David. And building and sharing inventories of observational capacities for discovery and integration across a highly fragmented and distributed landscape of Arctic observing systems. So it was largely, there were some presentations, but it was largely discussion based, focused on three things. So use cases, what is the rationale really for inventories of observing activities and infrastructure such as research and monitoring sites, stations, facilities, platforms, projects, cruises, networks, etc. And then best practices. While being ethically open, how can we make metadata not about data sets, but about observing assets more findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable, the FAIR principles. And then talking about next steps. How can we help or incentivize organizations to build, share, and utilize inventories effectively? So yeah, next slide. So based on that discussion, we came away with 5 recommendations to the broader community. And so one was to encourage the creation and interoperable sharing of observing inventories. And this really to better meet a range of user needs that we've identified and observing goals. To promote the use of established solutions, and here we're talking about core fields, metadata standards, control vocabularies, to improve discovery and interoperability of inventories. And then work towards or through proposal scale efforts, the legwork of establishing the underlying data science and cyber infrastructure, including crosswalks, creating guidance documents, and more. A lot of this is sort of what the SAN Arctic Data Committee has been doing through Polder and the hackathons for some time, but we need more efforts like that for observing capacities. All this hopefully to establish more of a community norm of sharing inventories as standard practice. And then last but not least, sustainably fund and maintain inventories of polar observing assets. Funding, of course, always comes up, and all of these things then to identify geographic or thematic gaps in what we are measuring, to help co-locate or streamline implementation, minimize costs, facilitate collaboration, and connections between resources, and to better engage with local communities and community-based monitoring. Next step. Next slide. So there is a relevant short paper on observing inventories and a white paper on use cases led by San Khan. And then encourage everyone, if you're interested, to join our monthly meetings of the Polar Observing Assets Working Group. And just to note that a lot of these goals are shared with the coordination efforts of US AON. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, everybody. Really rich feedback. I hope this is encouraging Alice that we're all making great headway on our reports that are due to her on the 15th. And I just wanted to also note that, so we did a wide outreach to people who chaired sessions at the summit. There was a whole track on technology, and those folks were not able to join us here today. So just to kind of round out for those who weren't at the summit, your picture of other discussions, I think they had 3 different sessions talking about AI and drones and other aspects of technology and innovation to support the next generation of work. And then there were several other expert panel sessions, including a sort of expert panel community of practice session. There was a session on early career engagement that was led by Apex. And so just to kind of give you a full picture that by the time the report comes out, you'll see this content and more. And so maybe as Hazel's getting our breakout groups together, and I encourage everybody to turn your cameras on for your breakout groups. If anybody wants to kind of put something on the table in kind of a plenary mode before we break out, to remind you, the principal thing we're going to talk about during the breakouts is kind of this 18-month window of U.S. coordination. What kinds of things do we need to get going now, thinking about, in particular, ICARP 4 recommendations and the International Polar Year. Also thinking about what are those things that the community can lead on its own, and what are some of those things that are going to require federal leadership. So those are the breakout questions, but I guess a moment if anybody wants to put something on the table for breakout or maybe ask a clarifying question. Okay, that's the 7-second crickets of facilitation 101. So I guess that means everybody would like to save their discussion time for the breakout rooms, which is great. Hazel, are we ready to roll on that?